Thank you for joining us digitally this evening for our CCHM speaker series. These talks are sponsored by the Historic Preservation Commission, and tonight's broadcast is sponsored by Wager Audio. Now, our mission at the Clark County Historical Museum is to gather, save, and share the pieces and memories of Clark County. And the Historical Society has been performing that mission for over 100 years, and the museum for over 50 years. And now, tonight, we have a special opportunity, like we've had for several months, to bring our talk to you digitally and free of charge. And it's our intention to continue bringing you this content digitally or either in person for the rest of the year and into 2021. Now, to let you know about what we have coming up, on October 15th, we're actually going to be having our History on Tap event, and we're going to be doing that digitally. So it'll be a stream through YouTube, and it will be Campfire Tales 2, and the Zoom call was coming from the house. So it'll be another night with myself, Pat Gelata, and Jeff Davis telling some ghost stories, and we'll be doing that via a live stream. Our sponsors for that event are IQ Credit Union, the Courtney Irvin Trust, Wager Audio, Kiggins Theater, Vancouvers Downtown Association, and Zeppelin. So keep an eye out for that, and we'll have that available for you to be able to watch coming up. And then also in October, we're going to start our virtual haunted walking tours. They will be on every Friday and Saturday starting October 9th. So keep an eye out for that. And it'll be a different tour each night that you'll be able to tune in and watch. So keep an eye out for that this year. Just so you know, as of today, October 1st, we are back open to the public. So you can come in and enjoy the museum. We've changed things to fit the guidelines for the Safe Start for our state. So you're able to come in and enjoy the exhibits. And you can come in and check out our 4 galleries, which we have one History of Music, which is music, movement, and sound. We have Currents of Progress, which is an exhibit on rivers, roads, and ports. We have History of Brewing, which is a history of brewing and prohibition in Clark County. And then we have Her Story, Founders, Leaders, and Visionaries. And that exhibit is talking about the history of women in Clark County. So you can come down tomorrow or any other day going forward, Thursday through Saturday, 11 to 4, and come check out our exhibits. Now, please, if you want to know about this, sign up for our email list. Also, follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to receive updates and reminders about events. And we really appreciate you tuning in for tonight. And so tonight's talk is special. We have a CCHM member of our team that is doing this talk for us, April Buzby. She's a social impact specialist, and she'll be exploring the history of housing in Clark County from a racial equity and place-making perspective. And now April is actually the owner and operator of Lymantria Consulting, a social impact strategy firm, and the programs and marketing manager here at the Clark County Historical Museum. And she holds a BA in geography from Keene State College and a master's of community and regional planning from the University of Oregon. April is a recognized leader and speaker in tackling social justice and public policy issues that impact low-income housing and marginalized communities. And she is the lead author on the white paper, Crime Has No Home Here, Affordable Housing and Crime in Rural America. And the upcoming book, It's Not You, It's Your Policies, Why Policies, Not People Are Failing Your Organization. And so without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to April for her talk tonight.
Thanks, Brad, and thank you to everyone joining us here today. I was recently asked why housing and race. The fact is, housing is the foundation in which a community is built. It is the place where our stories begin and the first place they are shared. We know that a community's resilience to economic and natural events is often reliant on the connections and diversity of its population. The numbers show that how well our children succeed as adults is influenced by the neighborhoods and homes they grow up in. We also know that a community with a diversity of home options and strong sense of place is more appealing to businesses and a healthy workforce. To put it simply, who can access housing, where, and what barriers are in place for someone to find a place to call home in a community has a profound effect on not only that household, but the community as a whole. And that effect can continue long after those who made the decisions are gone and forgotten. But we often look at housing and racial issues in a very siloed fashion or as part of the past and no longer of any concern, which couldn't be farther from the truth. So today, what I want to do is look at a few key points in Clark County's history and explore how decisions made in those moments still reverberate in our community today. To unsilo the siloed moments of our past, which have been studied by a multitude of people and groups, and bring them together into a cohesive story of where we came from. It is my hope that this sparks a conversation in our community about who we want to be and how we can get there. So let's get started. Like any good story, we need to start at a beginning, which in this case would be Kanaka Village. You probably thought I was going to say Fort Vancouver, and in a way, this is that story. But as we're looking at how housing decisions in the past affect us today, Kanaka Village is definitely one of those stories. For those who are not familiar with Kanaka Village, a little background. When the Hudson Bay arrived in the Columbia River Basin and began establishing Fort Vancouver and other posts, they required a large number of laborers to support the forts and surrounding area. At this point, they were also establishing relations with the Kingdom of Hawaii and relying on the skills of Hawaiian sailors to help them make the Pacific crossing. This provided a ready-made pool of laborers to pull from, with Hawaiian laborers making their way to Fort Vancouver and Fort Astoria as crew on HPC's ships, and then remaining here to fulfill roles at the forts and throughout the region as farmers, miners, foresters, cooks, and others. Some estimates show that at its peak, the Hawaiian population made 30 to 50% of the total non-Indigenous population of the Columbia River Basin. Most of this workforce, along with a mix of some other low-ranked company employees, lived at Kanaka Village, a small multi-ethnic community just outside Fort Vancouver's walls. Relations between the European and Hawaiian population were strained. Records show issues with fighting, Hawaiians being ill-treated, and a general disregard of the Hawaiian workers as a respectable people with their own rich heritage and beliefs. With one account by Reverend Herbert Beaver, chaplain at Fort Vancouver from about 1836 to 1838, describing the Hawaiian population as, quote, half-reclaimed savages. However, the fort was heavily reliant on this workforce, and some accounts show respect for the hard work and contribution of the Hawaiian community, even while they were being abused and ridiculed by the same people. When Hudson Bay withdrew from the area and the U.S. military moved in, there was little interest in maintaining working relations between the fort and the residents of Kanaka Village. The people of the village were ordered to leave their homes, and in many cases, the lives that they had built here. Some refused to go. One story by writer Yvonne Mearns Clan describes how one Kanakan resident, William Kalahalehi, I hope I got that right, watched helplessly while the U.S. dismantled his home until only a shell remained, which they then burned to the ground. Not surprisingly, most of the Hawaiian workers, including William, eventually left the area after this, returning home to Hawaii or continuing employment with the Hudson Bay Company elsewhere. The few who remained usually had married into the local native nations and settled with their spouses' families. The story of Kanaka Village is one that is repeated throughout Clark County's history. After the dispersal of the Kanakans, we see a repeat of this behavior among the residents of the fort, who, when the area was unfit for officers' wives and other civilians, relied heavily on indigenous and other non-white laborers until such a time that European American civilians began arriving, and that once needed population is then pushed out. One such group is that of the Chinese immigrants who, after completing the Pacific Railroad, signed on to help develop Lakamis and labored to build the aqueduct that connected Lakamis Lake to the paper mill. This group, who not only built the aqueduct but also labored on the railroads, worked as miners, cooks, factory workers, foresters, farmers, sound a bit familiar? Found themselves abused and harassed by European Americans. After statehood, they found themselves barred from purchasing or owning land in the state and unwelcomed in Clark County, a situation that stood well into the mid-1900s, as we'll see a bit later. And once no longer needed, were forced to leave the lives they built in this community to seek work and a home elsewhere. Research around housing is currently somewhat limited from around the late 19th century until World War II. However, stories like that of the Buffalo Soldiers, who arrived in Vancouver in 1899 to take charge of the military base, only to be demoted from its leadership position as soon as white replacements arrived, are not unusual. Preliminary reviews indicate that many non-European Americans, particularly Asians and African Americans, often struggled to find employment here that provided security and wages that could support a family. When they did, barriers to housing, from overt racism to extremely high housing prices, made it nearly impossible for most to secure housing. This situation changed a bit once the U.S. became involved in World War II. As the shipyards of Clark County and Portland ramped up production, African Americans, mostly from the South, were drawn to the region with the promise of good-paying jobs. Initially, many of these working families either lived in tents or found housing in Portland. In response, 2 public housing projects were quickly created for this workforce: Vanport on the Oregon side of the Columbia and McLaughlin Heights here in Vancouver. At the peak, approximately 8,900 African Americans lived in Vancouver, working the shipyards, paper mills, and in various other positions throughout Clark County. The end of the war effort saw the opportunities which first drew African Americans to the community quickly dry up. While a VHA survey showed that over about 50% of African American families living in wartime housing intended to stay in the area in 1945, within a 4-week period, the population of McLaughlin Heights had dropped from 1,200 to 681 families. And by 1947, the entire African American population of Clark County was about 700. Stories during that period reflect the problems African Americans faced in Clark County. One story, recounted by Belva Jean Griffin in Melissa E. Williams' article, No Whites Only Signs Here, described the plight of Griffin's sister, Laura May, who, after calling to confirm an available housing unit, arrived at the home only to have the property owner shake his head and return indoors after seeing Laura May. Another, by Jonigan Perry, a former shipyard worker that remained in the area and one of the first African Americans to purchase a home in Vancouver post-World War II, describes harassment by police and locals for African Americans who were able to purchase or rent housing in Vancouver. The continued issues facing African Americans looking for housing in the private market meant that by 1950, most of this population still lived in VHA properties. Yet, it was determined that this housing, and ultimately VHA, was no longer needed, and the redevelopment of McLaughlin Heights and the surrounding area began, with a focus on large, higher-priced housing. This redevelopment period, from the end of the war until about the mid-1950s, not only saw the homes of the African American community being replaced with less affordable ones for most of these families, but also more overt issues of racial discrimination in housing and employment. In response, mayors Carter and Schumacher established housing commissions to tackle the housing discrimination issue. Their stated purpose was to help convince white property owners to sell or rent to black families and to reduce friction between these two groups. We also see the founding of the Vancouver branch of the NAACP, who looked to increase access to housing and employment for African Americans in the area. However, without any significant power to enforce rules regarding racial prejudice in housing, both relied heavily on social and political pressure to move the needle. Interestingly, research by the NAACP shows that during the same time that the city was publicly calling for housing equality, they were also greenlighting a proliferation of racial covenants in new neighborhoods throughout Vancouver, many concentrated around McLaughlin Heights. This map shows a few of the neighborhoods developed between 1940 and 1950 that included racial covenants limiting home ownership to white and Caucasian homeowners. The legacy of the decisions of our past still echo in our community today. The Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander population, which once accounted for nearly 30% of the population in Clark County, now make up less than 2% of our population. However, their contribution to the region is still strong in our culture and placemaking, even today, through local names, food, and cultural events. Even while the story of their lives as important contributors to the early development of Clark County has been relegated to dusty bookshelves and academia. While many Chinese immigrants labored to build much of the early infrastructure that helped this region grow, very few families from that time actually remain. Asians now make up one of the fastest growing populations in Clark County, yet their contribution to our early development mostly remains as a footnote at best. And although the Black community has done much to help this community, from the service of the Buffalo Soldiers to the laborers at the paper mills and shipyards, Blacks only make up about 2% of our population. What's more, this population is heavily concentrated in areas that were developed either before World War II or after the 1950s, as is evidenced when overlaid with a map of the Covenant neighborhoods surrounding McLaughlin Heights. Essentially, a form of de facto segregation still exists and this is well noted to perpetuate reduced educational and economic opportunities for children. What's more, affordable housing has consistently lagged behind our growth. The Joint Center for Housing Studies of Harvard University shows that the region has seen a 50 to 60% decline in affordable housing since 2011, all while housing prices continue to grow and housing units are consistently being added. Without this housing, young families and people just beginning their career find themselves shut out of our community, particularly minority households who often make significantly less than their white peers. In response, the city adopted the Multifamily Housing Tax Exemption Program, which provides tax exemptions for developers of new or rehabbed residential units. The intent being that the tax exemption would promote development, which includes an affordable housing component. Yet, since it was adopted in 2016, only 22% of the units built are actually affordable. 47% of the projects have no affordable units at all. In addition, the program uses income from the Portland metropolitan area instead of Vancouver. So it's questionable if any of these units are actually affordable for Vancouver incomes. This forces residents to seek work in Portland, increasing traffic congestion pressures and perpetuating the loss of skilled workers and businesses in our community. This program represents millions in tax exemptions, but has historically done little to ease the housing burden in our community, as evidenced with the continuing slumping growth of many minority groups and a continuing homeless problem in our community. We have yet to see the consequences of COVID in our housing market, but as evidenced in other communities throughout the U.S., we are likely to see issues with evictions and more families once on the margins finding themselves unable to afford to stay in the area. And this will predominantly be minority populations. These stories of race-based housing decisions represent only a small glimpse of the struggles our BIPOC neighbors have faced in making Clark County their home. There are many others, some not yet uncovered. As I said in the beginning, the goal of this presentation is to begin a conversation, however. So, in the words of Eleanor Roosevelt, we face the future fortified with the lessons we have learned of the past. It is today that we must create the world of the future.
All right. Well, I want to thank April for putting together this incredible talk tonight. And I also want to thank everyone who tuned in. Again, this is Brad Richardson, the Executive Director of the Clark County Historical Museum. And just thank you so much for watching our digital feed tonight, and stay tuned. Sign up for our email list or like us on social media so you can see what next speaker series event we'll have coming up in November. And also, if you want to support us, you can go to our website, cchmuseum.org, and you can either donate to help us out and invest in our work, saving our community story, or you can become a member, which is really helpful for us. And then you get some of the great member benefits, which you can check out on our website. Again, thank you, everybody. Thank you, April, for the talk tonight. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. And we will see you next month on another digital feed for our CCHM speaker series. And thank you one more time to our sponsors, the Historic Preservation Commission of Clark County and Wager Audio. Everyone, thanks and have a great night.